The call came in at 6:45 on a Thursday, which meant I was already on my second job of the day and hadn't eaten since 5:30 in the morning. The property was in Westmount, the kind of neighborhood where the houses sit back from the street, behind old maples and iron gates, and the driveways are long enough that you can't see the front door from the road. I'd done work up here before, big houses, small problems, people who looked at you like you'd tracked mud on something expensive even when you hadn't moved yet. I pulled my truck through the gate and parked behind a catering van that had no business being there on a Thursday evening. The moment I stepped out, I could hear it. A generator somewhere around the back running rough, lights flickering through the ground floor windows, in a way that said somebody had already tried to fix this and made it worse. The front door opened before I knocked. Not the homeowner. A woman in a black uniform shirt gave me a look that said she was relieved I existed and walked me through a side hall without a word. The main floor was set up for something. Long tables, flowers, wine glasses already out. 30, maybe 40 people expected. The catering crew was moving around trying to act normal while half the track lighting above the dining room kept dropping in and out every few seconds like a bad heartbeat. Then I heard her voice from the kitchen. Not loud, not panicked. Clear and controlled in the way that only comes from someone who has spent years making sure rooms don't spiral when they start to tilt. She was on her phone, one hand resting flat on the kitchen island, talking to what sounded like a venue electrician, who had apparently already been and gone and solved nothing. She said, "I understand that. What I need to know is whether it's the panel or the line because the guests arrive in 90 minutes and I have 30 candles on that table and I am not doing that." She ended the call and turned around. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, the kind of face that looked like it made decisions for a living and was currently extremely unimpressed with the one it had been handed. Her eyes moved to me fast. "You're from Rideau Electrical?" "Yeah, I'm Joel." I stopped myself. "Sorry, Garrett. People call me by my last name." She didn't blink at that. "Okay, Garrett. I have a fundraiser starting at 8. Tell me what I'm dealing with. Give me 10 minutes with the panel and I'll tell you exactly." She nodded once and a woman in the uniform shirt appeared from somewhere and took me down to the basement. The panel was in a utility room behind the wine storage. I opened it and saw immediately that someone had reset a breaker that should have stayed tripped. There was a partial short somewhere upstream, something drawing inconsistent load. The generator they'd brought in as a backup was fighting with the main feed instead of isolating from it, which was why everything upstairs was flickering. I traced the line for 7 minutes, found a junction that had been improperly capped after what looked like a renovation 2 years ago, and went back upstairs. She was standing in the dining room watching one of the catering staff adjust a centerpiece. When I came in, she crossed toward me without waiting. "Improperly capped junction in the east wall run," I said. "Someone's renovation work. I can isolate it in about 20 minutes, which means you lose the track lighting in this room but everything else comes stable. Your generator gets disconnected from the main feed entirely and runs the kitchen circuit only. You'll want candles on anyway." She looked at the table, then at me. "You're telling me the track lighting was always going to go. For tonight, yes. You can run the dining room on the sconces and pendants. Those are on a separate line, and they'll hold fine. It'll actually look better than track lighting for what you're doing in here." Something in her expression shifted. Not fully, but enough that I noticed, like she'd walked into a conversation expecting to have to argue and found she didn't need to. "Do it," she said. Then, quieter, "Thank you for not making that sound like a disaster. It's not a disaster, it's just inconvenient." That almost made her smile. She turned back to the room and I went to work. 22 minutes later, the sconces along the dining room walls were pulling clean power, and the pendants over the table were steady and warm. The kitchen was running off the generator, isolated and stable. The flickering was gone. I could hear the catering team's energy change the moment the lights stopped jumping. That shift when a room stops holding its breath. I was packing up my bag in the hall when she came back. "It held," she said. "Should hold all night. I'll need to come back and do the proper repair on that junction, but for tonight you're fine." She handed me her card. Not the event coordinator's card, not a business card for some office assistant. Hers. Eleanor Ashby, printed clean and simple, a direct number handwritten in ink below the printed one. "Use this when you come back," she said. Not the main line. I looked at it once in the truck with rain starting up against the windshield and sat there longer than I needed to before I drove away. I told myself I wasn't thinking about Eleanor Ashby after that Thursday's Westmount. That was a half-truth at best. The card sat in my work bag for 3 days before I moved it somewhere I'd actually find it again, which probably tells you everything. I'd been doing electrical work on my own for 4 years by then. Before that, I'd apprenticed under my uncle's company up in Sudbury, done 2 years with a commercial outfit in Ottawa, then gone independent when I moved to Montreal for reasons that no longer existed by the time I'd signed the lease. The business was solid. I wasn't rich, but I was steady, and I'd learned to keep my head down and my invoices clean and not get attached to the houses I worked in, even the beautiful ones. Eleanor's house was beautiful in the way that feels earned rather than purchased, not a showcase, a place where someone actually lived. She texted 6 days later, late afternoon while I was finishing a job in Verdun, the East Wall Junction. "Are you available this week?" I wrote back that I could do Thursday afternoon. She said that worked, and that was the whole conversation. I thought about it more than I should have on the drive home. Thursday the house was completely different. No catering van, no staff moving through rooms, no energy of something about to happen. Just the house and the low gray light of a November afternoon coming through the big windows and Eleanor answering the door herself in a dark sweater and jeans, a coffee mug in one hand. "Come in," she said. "I'll stay out of your way." She didn't stay out of my way, not in an intrusive way, not hovering or asking questions every 30 seconds. More like she moved through the house doing her own work, and didn't feel any particular need to disappear because I was there. I could hear her on a call in what sounded like a study down the hall. I could hear her typing. After about 40 minutes she appeared in the doorway of the utility room with a second mug. "I didn't know how you take it," she said. "So there's milk on the counter in the kitchen if you need it." "Black is fine, thank you." She leaned against the doorframe and watched me work for a moment. Not uncomfortably. More like she was thinking about something else and her eyes had just landed here. "You handled the other night well," she said. "The team was starting to lose it when the lights kept going. You came in and it just settled. Good problem to have. A fixable one. Most people would have made it feel worse than it was. Most people need you to feel like it's serious so you understand why it's taking so long." She made a small sound, something between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "That's a cynical way to put it. It's an honest way." She looked at me then. Not the way she'd looked at me the first night when she was assessing whether I could solve her problem. This was different, slower. "Fair enough," she said and went back down the hall. The junction repair took another 40 minutes. When I finished and walked back through the house to let her know, I found her at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, and her laptop open and her mug pushed to one side. She looked up. "Done? Done. The line's clean. You shouldn't have any issues. What do I owe you?" I told her the amount. She didn't flinch, didn't negotiate. Just pulled out her phone to transfer payment and said, "Is there anything else in the house I should know about? Your panel's older. Not urgent, but worth planning for in the next couple of years." She nodded like she was filing that away. "I'll call you when I'm ready for that conversation." I picked up my bag. She walked me to the door. "Garrett," she said when I was already on the front step. I turned around. "You're good at what you do," she said. "I mean that straightforwardly. It's not a small thing." I didn't have a quick answer for that. People thanked me, complimented the work, said they'd call again. They didn't usually look at me like they meant to land something. "Thanks," I said, which was probably the most insufficient word available. She smiled, not wide. The kind of smile that stays close to the person who owns it. I walked back to my truck thinking about that smile for the entire drive home. She called on a Monday 3 weeks later. Not a text. An actual call, which meant something, though I couldn't have said what. "I know this isn't a normal request," she said, "but I'm at a venue on Sherbrooke for a planning meeting, and I think there's something wrong with their lighting system in the back room, and they're about to try to fix it themselves. I don't have a relationship with their electrical people, and I don't want to wait for them to make it worse. Could you come by and at least take a look? You're calling your own electrician to a venue." A pause. "Yes, is that strange? A little, but I'm available." I could hear something in her voice just at the edge of it. Not embarrassment exactly. More like she'd made a choice and was deciding whether to explain it. She didn't explain it. She sent me the address. The venue problem was a tripped GFCI that someone had bypassed instead of replacing, which was exactly the kind of thing that could go wrong at the worst time. I fixed it in 20 minutes. Eleanor was in a meeting in the front room, and when it broke up and she came to find me, 2 other people came with her. A man in his 50s who looked like he ran something important and a younger woman with a tablet who took notes while other people talked. "Garrett," Eleanor said, in the same tone she used at her house. Not performing, not positioning, just using my name. The man in his 50s looked at me with the particular expression that some people use when they're trying to figure out how you fit in. Eleanor said, "He solved your backroom problem. You're welcome." She said it without heat, without drama. The man laughed, slightly surprised, and shook my hand. In the car afterward, driving back across town, I kept thinking about the way she'd said it. "He solved your backroom problem. You're welcome." Not an introduction, an assertion. After that, the calls came more regularly, and after a while they stopped being entirely about electrical work. She had a property in the Laurentians she used in the winter, and there was an issue with the outdoor lighting along the drive that needed sorting before the snow came in hard. She asked if I could come up on a Saturday. I said yes, which I told myself was a professional decision. We drove up in her car, which was quieter and more comfortable than anything I'd ever sat in, and she drove the way I would have expected. Efficiently, one hand on the wheel, radio on low, talking easily about nothing particular, and not filling the silence when it came. The work at the chalet took most of the afternoon. She made coffee, disappeared for a while with her laptop on the back deck, wrapped in a wool blanket, appeared again when I was finishing. We ate at a small place in the village that she seemed to know well, and the owner greeted her by name but didn't make a show of it. And we sat by a window with the early dark coming down outside and ate lake fish and bread and talked for 2 hours without either of us tracking the time. She told me she'd started the events company 12 years ago when she was 28, after a job at a large firm in Toronto that she'd been good at and profoundly unhappy in. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. She said the first 3 years were the kind of hard that changes your relationship with money permanently. And she still felt it sometimes, the reflex to check the account before she ordered anything, even now when it was unnecessary. I told her I understood that specific feeling better than most things she could have said. She looked at me across the table. How long were you on your own before it started to feel real? About 2 years. Then I got a big commercial contract and it felt real overnight, and I've been waiting for the floor to drop out ever since. She laughed. Actually laughed, clear and unguarded. That never entirely goes away. You're telling me that as a comfort? I'm telling you that as someone who still checks her account balance before ordering the expensive bottle of wine. She picked up her glass and tilted it slightly toward me. For the record, this one's fine. I didn't know when it started feeling different from a client dinner. Maybe it already felt different by then, and I was choosing not to notice. On the drive back to the city, she fell quiet somewhere past Saint-Jérôme. Not tired quiet, but thinking quiet, and I didn't push it. When we got back to her street in Westmount, she turned off the car but didn't move to get out right away. This was a good day, she said. Yeah, I said, it was. She looked at me for a moment, just looked. Then she said goodnight and got out of the car, and I sat there in my truck in the dark for longer than was normal before I drove home. I started being honest with myself sometime around December. She wasn't calling me about electrical work anymore. Or she was, but that wasn't why she was calling. A switch she wanted moved in the upstairs office. Outdoor sockets on the back terrace. Things that could have waited, things that could have been handled by anyone, things that gave her a reason to say, "Are you free Thursday?" and both of us pretended was still professional. I told myself it made no sense. I knew what her life looked like from the outside. The house, the car, the clients, the kind of events she organized, that got written up in places I didn't read. I showed up with a work bag and a truck that was paid off but not new, and hands that had been cut and stained enough times that they never looked entirely clean anymore. She moved in a world that had a different grammar than mine. But the thing about Eleanor was that she didn't act like those two things were in opposition. She didn't seem to notice the gap the way I noticed it, or if she did, she'd decided it wasn't interesting enough to remark on. One evening in January, she asked me to stay for dinner without any pretense of an excuse. Just, I made too much food and I don't eat well alone. Stay, so I stayed. The kitchen was warm and she was comfortable in it in the easy way that meant she'd cooked for herself for years rather than for performance. We ate at the island instead of the dining table, which felt deliberate, and somewhere around the second glass of wine, I said something about wanting to do custom restoration work eventually. Panel upgrades and antique wiring in heritage properties. The kind of niche work that takes patience and doesn't pay well at first, but that I'd been thinking about for a long time. She put down her glass. You've never mentioned that before. Didn't seem relevant. It's completely relevant. She was looking at me with that focused look she got when she was genuinely interested in something, not polite interested, actually interested. Have you looked at any properties? Is there a market for it in Montreal? Some. The Plateau has a lot of older stock, so does Outremont. It would take a while to build the reputation for it. But you want it? Yeah, I want it. She nodded slowly like she was putting something in a specific place in her mind. I noticed it, but I didn't think about it hard enough. Later, standing at the door to leave, she said, Garrett, for what it's worth, the thing you described. It sounds like exactly the right work for you. I drove home in the January cold and thought about the fact that she'd said that, and what it was like to have someone hear a thing I'd said like it mattered. She asked me to come with her to a gallery opening in February. An artist she'd worked with on a corporate installation, a Friday evening event in the Mile End. She said it as if it were a simple thing, the way you'd ask someone if they wanted to grab coffee while you were both already on the same street. I looked down at my jacket, which was clean but was still the jacket I wore to job sites. Eleanor, what? You know what? She tilted her head, not impatiently, more like she was trying to understand why I kept returning to the same corner. I know that you think there's a reason this is complicated, she said. I'm less convinced. Your clients will be there, probably, and I'll be there as what? She crossed her arms and looked at me with something that was not quite frustration, but was related to it. As the person I wanted to bring, she said, which is a complete sentence. I didn't answer right away. She let the silence run. You do this, she said finally, quieter. You say things like that, about my world, about where you fit, about what makes sense. And I understand where it comes from, but Garrett, every time you say it, you're also saying that you don't trust me to know what I'm doing. And I know what I'm doing. That landed somewhere it was supposed to. That's not what I mean, I said. I know it's not what you mean. I'm telling you what it sounds like. She looked at me steadily. Come to the opening. You don't have to perform anything. Just come. I went. The gallery was full of people who were interesting in various ways. And I didn't know most of them, and it didn't matter. Because Eleanor stayed close the whole evening in the specific way that isn't dramatic or possessive, but is unmistakable. When a man I didn't recognize came over and asked with that careful politeness how Eleanor and I knew each other, she said, Garrett's with me, without a pause, and turned back to the conversation she'd been having. 3 words. Nothing complicated about them. I felt them settle somewhere in my chest and stay there. On the way out, she handed me her coat from the check and said, That wasn't so bad, it was fine, I said. Fine. She raised an eyebrow. Good, I said. It was good. She smiled at that and didn't push it further, and we walked out into the cold February night, and the street was bright with ice, and I didn't want to say goodbye. The thing about almost losing something is that it clarifies everything you were pretending wasn't there. It happened in March. Not a big event, no single argument. Just one night when I'd been in my own head for too long, adding things up wrong, coming out with the wrong number. I was at her house after work late, and she was tired in a way she sometimes let me see, and instead of just being there, I started talking. About what this was. About whether it made sense. About the gap between our lives that I kept measuring even though she'd told me to stop. She listened, she didn't interrupt. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Is that what you think? She asked. I don't know what I think. That's the problem. She stood up slowly and picked up her glass and walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter with her back to me for a moment. I thought, this is it. You finally said the thing that was too much. Then she said, without turning around, I'm going to go get something. I'll be back in a few minutes. She came back with a folder. She set it on the table in front of me. I opened it. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Property documents. A building on Beaubien Street in Westmount, in the neighborhood I'd mentioned once, casually, as the kind of place I'd look eventually. Ground floor commercial space with a back area large enough for equipment. Natural light from north-facing windows. Zoned for light trades. I looked up at her. Eleanor, I've been in contact with the owners since January, she said. The lease terms are reasonable and I've drafted a proposal. You don't have to take it, but I need you to understand that I have been paying attention to every single thing you've told me about what you want. And that this, she put her hand flat on the folder, is what I do when I'm serious about something. My mouth had gone dry. You can't just, I can, she said. I'm not giving it to you. I'm removing every excuse you've been using to tell yourself this doesn't make sense. I looked at the papers, then at her. She was standing very still, and her face had that same look from the very first night when the lights were out and people were panicking and she had already made up her mind. Why? I said. It was the only word I had. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down and looked at me with the directness I'd noticed from the very beginning, that complete lack of performance. Because you listen when I talk, she said. Not to be polite, actually listen. Because you showed up in my house in the middle of a circus and made it feel like something that could be fixed. Because you came into the studio I don't show people and looked at the paintings I've never let anyone see and said you liked the room more than the rest of the house, and I knew you meant it. She stopped, and because when you leave I noticed the quiet in a way I didn't used to. The room was entirely still. I've spent a long time, she said, being smart about things that didn't deserve it and careless about things that did. I'm trying to be smarter now. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, tell me more about the property on Beaubien. Something moved across her face then, something real and unguarded, and she laughed once, quiet and startled, and reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We sat like that for a long time, the folder open between us and the city quiet outside and the lights in her house steady and warm, the way lights are supposed to be.